presentations often begin with like the polling of the audience. So let me just do an informal poll. By show of hands, how many of you do outstanding work? Raise your hand if you're really good at your job. All right, very good. How many of you feel, as a result of the work that you do, that you're making a difference in the lives of at least one human being? Let's see those hands. And how many of you feel, as a result of the work that you do, that you deserve a $90,000 a year pay increase? Oh, they can't compensate you. The world can't pay you enough for the work that you do. So I offer you a story in the form of a gift in the form of a story. Are you familiar with a baseball player named Lou Gehrig? For those of you not raising your hand, Lou Gehrig played baseball 100 years ago, and he was teammates with a man named Babe Ruth. In the 1960s, they made a movie about his life called The Pride of the Yankees, and Lou Gehrig went in front of 40,000 screaming Yankee fans and gave his retirement speech, which went like this. Today, and there was an echo in the stadium, today, I feel like the luckiest man on the face of this earth. Today, I feel like the luckiest man on the face of this earth. How could he be lucky? He was dying. Lou Gehrig was dying of a condition which they later named after him, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. You've heard of Lou Gehrig's disease. So I went on the internet, looked up the backstory. The story that I read was that the day before he gave the speech, there was a 12-year-old boy in the hospital. The boy was sick and he was dying, and he refused to take his medication. And doctors told the boy's mother, your son will be dead soon unless he takes his medication. The mother knew that Lou Gehrig was her son's hero, so she called the Yankee organization and asked if Lou Gehrig could come to the hospital to convince her son to take his medication. So he showed up, and the boy's eyes got so big, he saw his hero, and he said, I'm still not going to take my medication unless you hit a home run tomorrow. And Lou Gehrig said, okay, I'll hit a home run tomorrow. He didn't hit a home run. He hit two. Now fast forward. Right before he gave the speech, the mother called the Yankee organization, and word got to Lou Gehrig that her son started taking his medication. He felt lucky because he was able to help someone. And you're fortunate because you help others for a living. And of course, your clients are fortunate because of your great work. I have been a certified alcohol and drug abuse counselor for 38 years. My entire adult life, I've been a drug abuse counselor. And people ask me, how have I done this work so long? I'll share with you one more story and then we'll get to our content. In March of 1995, I was giving a speech in Downers Grove, Illinois. And Downers Grove, Illinois is a suburb just west of Chicago. And there was a woman, an African-American woman, who attended the seminar, who sat in the front row, center aisle seat. And she asked, was I the same Mark Sanders who worked at a detox center a decade earlier, like in 1985? I said, yeah, that's me. She says, I was a patient on the detox unit. You were my counselor. And I don't always remember names, but I remember faces and I remember stories. So here's her story. She was addicted to cocaine and heroin, and she supported her habit through prostitution. In fact, she sold her body not too far from our detox facility. And I worked the evening shift. Some evenings as I was driving home at midnight, I'd see her on the corner selling her body. She looked really bad to me. You know how when a person starts using drugs, they stop eating food, they lose a lot of weight? I remember seeing her at midnight and saying, boy, she looks really bad. I don't think she'll ever recover. Am I the only person in this training who's ever had a counselor, a client that you thought would never change? See, that's why I'm convinced that computers will never be counselors. It's not like you can feed information to a computer who will recover or who won't recover. Although, if the job of a counselor is about empathy, compassion, and patience, especially patience, and more patience, machines are getting really close to us. Once I was staying in a Ritz-Carlton hotel in Washington, D.C., I put $1 in a pop machine and couldn't figure out what brand of soda I wanted. When I was standing there, the machine said, sorry you're having a difficult time. Take your time. Sounded like a licensed therapist to me. Anyway, there she was, sitting in the front row of my seminar a decade later. And I looked down and I saw the initials behind her name, LCSW CADC, licensed clinical social worker, certified alcohol and drug abuse counselor from street prostitution. So let's talk. So during the break, she told me that after she left our detox facility, she went back out to the streets to do more research. That's what we used to call relapse back then, research. She found out she had an addiction. She made her way back to detox. I did the assessment. And then she went to like Narcotics Anonymous meetings. And then she told me she went from there to a community college where she got her GED. She stayed in the community college and she received an associate's degree. Then she told me she went to university and got a bachelor's degree in social work. And then she went one more year and she got her master's degree in social work from street prostitution. And then she worked for 2 years after she got her MSW. So Mark, then I was ready to sit for the licensure exam. One of the questions they asked on the application for licensure, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And she checked yes. In the state of Illinois, denied her the right to take the exam. She said, but I fought too hard to give up that easy. I appealed it and she became licensed. When she told me that story, I told her that you didn't make my day. Literally, she made my decade. It's these recovery stories that ultimately keep us going all these years. And I'm happy to be doing the same kind of work that you're doing. Let us begin. So the presentation is entitled Counseling African Americans with Substance Use Disorders. And we start with several premises. The first premise, and this comes from a man by the name of Peter Bell, who was one of the first to travel the country and talk about counseling African Americans with substance use disorders. Peter Bell said, across cultures, addiction is characterized by increased tolerance, where it takes more for you to get high, loss of control where you struggle to stop, and continued use of the drug in spite of adverse consequences. A friend of mine, James Brumlin, used to say that addiction does not discriminate. It's an equal opportunity employer. James said that, that addiction affects butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers. The progression is similar across cultures. Peter Bell went on to say, however, addiction is best treated when the cultural context in which it develops is taken into consideration. So let's look at the cultural context for African Americans. It includes historical trauma and police brutality. Does anyone know how long African Americans have been experiencing police brutality? Anyone know how long? I did the research on that. 401 years. African Americans have experienced police brutality the whole time that they have been in the States. In the beginning, 401 years ago, the police were used to make sure that they would not escape. Somebody might need to mute themselves. And then they were also used 401 years ago to punish those that did escape. Culture taken away. You know, the group that has the highest alcoholism rate in the world are Native Americans because their culture was taken away. Their children were placed in boarding schools and they were separated from the teachings of their grandmother and the teachings of their grandfather. About 21 years ago, me and 7 African-American social workers took a trip to a country called Ghana, located in West Africa. And we were on a plane for 18 hours. I will never fly 18 hours again. I couldn't sleep for 18 hours. I had a headache you wouldn't believe. My sinuses were making it hard for me to breathe. On top of all of that, when we landed in Ghana, West Africa, my luggage was lost. Didn't have a clue what to expect. Our first stop was to meet with a group of elders between the ages of 60 to 90 years old. And these elders were sitting in a circle. And one of my friends asked the elders, how do you feel about us as African Americans? When he asked that question, it was so quiet you could almost hear a pin drop. I said, why'd you ask that question? He said, man, I waited my whole life to ask that one question. How do you feel about us as African Americans? We were not prepared for their response. They said, we love you. We think about you more than you know, and we pray for you. We were crying like babies. Actually, as soon as the elder says, we love you, we think about you more than you know, and we pray for you, an 85-year-old man stood up and started singing a song. The lyrics were, you've come back home. And all 35 of them were singing this song to you've come back home. And the story they told us that was that 200 years ago, there was an African and a Ghanaian that was being forced on the ships to the America to be enslaved. He looked back on the shores of Ghana and said, I'll be back home one day. And after they sung the song, they looked at us and they said, for all we know, that one of you can be the descendants of that man. Welcome home. And we started to cry. And the time we were there, we realized how much culture we lost. Can I share with you? Don't get mad at me when I share this with you. You realize that African Americans have lost so much culture has been taken away. Even the original African languages were taken away. We lost so much culture. We have to make up holidays. Do you know that Kwanzaa is a made up holiday? We have lost so much culture that the youth have developed their own culture called hip hop. And again, culture is what you fall back on during difficult times. Those of you living in the South, if you want to know why so many of us that moved to the North, like Chicago and Detroit, why we lost our mind in the North, was because we were separated from the culture and the teachings of the grandparents in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, et cetera. And you remember back in the day, the treatment for one of us when we lost our mind in the North was to go spend the summer in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia. Discrimination, poorly performing schools, high unemployment. They say the future of employment in America is science, technology, engineering, and math. And yet, if you go to a poorly performing elementary and high school, it might be difficult then to pursue a high-paying STEM job. Community trauma, police brutality, gang violence, shootings within the neighborhoods. All of this is the backdrop of substance use disorders amongst African Americans and high arrest and imprisonment rates. Let's talk about that. High arrest and imprisonment rates. The year is 1986. I want you to think about how old you were in 1986, what you were doing in your life in 1986, how you wore your hair in 1986. I'm trying to put you in the mood of the year 1986. For 1986 was a year that crack cocaine replaced marijuana as the #1 street drug. The year was 1986. You see, if you remember, there was a stand-up comic named Richard Pryor, who in 1985 was running down Santa Monica Boulevard. He was on flames, remember that? He had freebase cocaine. And when you freebase cocaine, ether is used, and ether is very flammable. So in 1986, street scientists decided there needed to be a safer way to use cocaine. So they took it out the ether and they replaced it with baking soda, and that was the birth of crack. And why do they call crack crack? Because when baking soda was heated, it makes a cracking noise. May 29th, 1986. May 29th, 1986, I was giving my first speech ever. And someone said, is there a Mark Sanders in this room? There's an emergency. Your mother's on the line. Take the call. She told me that my dad died in a little bitty closet at work, and he was smoking the drug of his choice, cocaine. They found my dad and they found the pipe. And that was May 29, 1986. June 15, 1986, there was a basketball player named Len Bias. Len Bias, they said, was the second coming of Michael Jordan. Believe it or not, to this day, in barbershops, they still talk about who was better, Michael Jordan or Len Bias. They say that Len Bias jumped so high, if he went in the air on a Monday, when he came down, it was Tuesday. Trust me here, I live in Chicago. If Len Bias would have played with Larry Bird and Kevin McHale and 4 other Hall of Famers from the Boston Celtics, the Bulls will not win 6 championships in a row. So Len Bias was drafted #1 by the Boston Celtics. Do you remember what happened? He went to a party and snorted some cocaine to celebrate being drafted #1 by the Celtics. He had a heart attack and he died. And how close is Maryland, the university, to Washington, D.C., where Congress meets? Very close. Congress got angry following his death. They loved that team. And so Congress in 1986, after the death of Len Bias, they intensified Richard Nixon's war on drugs. I want you to look at these numbers. In 1985, prior to Len Bias's death, there were 400,000 inmates in our nation's prison. And as they intensified the war on drugs, meaning arresting a bunch of African American and Latino Hispanics, the numbers swell from 400,000 in 85 to 1 million in 1995. And by 2005, the prison population doubled again to 2 million. Today, they estimate 2.4 million individuals in our nation's prisons. Many of them are there for drug-related offenses. Why is that important? It's important because, you know, there's evidence that says that a felony arrest has longer-term consequences than being addicted to drugs. Because if you're addicted to drugs, you can always stop. But if you get that felony arrest, those consequences follow you for a long time. It's called difficulty getting employment. You know, we can learn a lot from Portugal. I don't want to forget to say this. The country of Portugal once had a president who was addicted to heroin and got into recovery. and he became the president of the country. And so he had compassion for addiction. What a book said that I read is, in America, we make it as hard as possible for someone to get a job when they have a felony arrest. In Portugal, the president of the country started giving corporations tax breaks to hire people early in their recovery. In America, we make it as hard as possible. It's called the felony arrest. So another premise is that cross-cultural tension that exists outside of the counseling office with African Americans and other communities can exist within our office. In other words, here's what I'm saying. If you are white, the tension that exists between whites and blacks outside of the counseling office will exist within the offices as well. If you're Latino Hispanic, those tensions that exist amongst African Americans, Latino Hispanics outside of counseling will exist inside of the counseling office. The fourth premise is about intercultural tension. And that is, the tension exists interculturally between African Americans and how that can show up in the counseling space. Like differences along the line of age. We often judge the young, or gender differences. You know, like the challenges that exist in African American communities between Black men and Black women. And is it possible for those tensions to show up in the counseling relationship when Black men and Black women are working together, client counselor? Complexion, lightness and darkness. Counselor's dark, client is light. Does that influence the process? And then, of course, socioeconomic status. You know, I made it, why can't you? Sometimes that attitude can be present. And then the next premise is that there are many protective factors that reduce rates of substance use disorders among African Americans. Look at this. Year after year, Samson does an annual drug report by race and gender. And just about every year, those reports reveal that African Americans rank third or fourth in terms of amounts of drug use. Let's go backwards. With all of the stuff that we just talked about, all of this trauma that African Americans have endured, the question is, as it pertains to drug use, how come they're not number one? As a matter of fact, let me whisper this. Most of the Black teenagers I work with are primarily smoking marijuana. Most of the wealthy white youth I've worked with are using heroin, they're using speed, they're using acid, LSD, all kind of drugs. So here's the question. What are some substance use protective factors for African Americans? What protects African Americans from heavy substance use to the point where they're like third or fourth in terms of amount used? Let's put your response in chat. What are those protective factors?
Some that I'm seeing include the cost, church, poverty, social location, access, money, social supports, lack of trust, love, socially accepted.
Okay, so check this out. So I interview lots of like 14 to like 19-year-old like Black males, and I say, you know, how come you don't smoke crack? And they say things like, because my aunt smoked crack and she sold her body in the alley. And how come you don't use heroin? Well, my uncle died with a spike in his arm from using heroin. Plus, those who are gang affiliated say the gangs don't want you to use heroin and crack because you'll be unreliable. You'll become a snitch. So no dare videos are needed. They know from their own experience. And they tell me, get this, especially those who live in big cities like Atlanta and Chicago and Harlem. If you drink alcohol and you get drunk, you walk down the street, you're staggering. And so you feel vulnerable in the community. So we just instead smoke weed. However, this is really important what I'm about to say. The research says, because one of these young people tell me I'll never use heroin, I'll never smoke crack. The research says that once a person uses marijuana, they smoke marijuana over 220 days in a year, they're likely to start using those other drugs, even if they say they never will. And get this, many young person I work with who primarily smoke weed only, by the time they reach their 21st birthday, many of them will go to the liquor store and legally purchase alcohol. Let me add to the list of protective factors. Kinship like bonds, taking in extended family. You know, African Americans have their own child welfare system where like there might be a kid on the block whose parents can't take care of him, and my family might take him in. Kinship like bonds helps. Spirituality helps. Someone praying for you like a grandmother. In fact, let me tell you a story. And this story is called That We Didn't Get Enough Mothering Because Our Mother Didn't Get Enough Fathering. I'll repeat it. That me and my siblings didn't get enough mothering because our mother didn't get enough fathering. You see, my mother was her father's favorite, but he couldn't give her the love that she needed because he was so intoxicated every day. So my mother became man hungry. And then when I was a junior in high school, my mother was taking care of her husband who was actively heroin addicted. And my biological father went to prison on possession of pounds of marijuana with the plan to distribute. So now I'm forced to go live with my grandparents. I'm bitter. They're kind of old to me, and I was disrespectful. I talked back, and it seemed like the worse I act, my grandmother, who was a saint, the kinder she became. So I remember failing a bunch of classes when my father was in prison. I went to my grandfather and said, "Give me money for summer school." He says, "I'm not giving you anything. If you want to destroy your life, I'm not paying for it." And my grandmother came in the kitchen where I was talking to my grandfather with tears in her eyes. She said to my grandfather, "Give him the money. I love her." She loved me. My grandmother was a saint. She went to church 8 days out of a 7-day week. She loved me. So I got 2 A's in summer school, all A's my senior year in high school. In 6 years of college, I never got a grade lower than B. So a few years before my grandmother died, I'm sitting at her bedside and I said, "Grandmother, did you know I'd make something good out of my life? That I would have a biographical sketch like the one that James read to you today? Did you know that I would do good things in my life?" She said, "No, I didn't know." She says, "I didn't know. I just figured you had the devil in you, so I prayed him out of you." You see, some of our clients have the elders that are praying for them, some of the young people, and that helps. A sense of humor. They say the shortest distance between two people is a good laugh. That basically means, if we were to pause on this, if these protective factors help African Americans prevent heavy substance use, then they can also be like sources of support and recovery. If I can just give you an example, extended family orientation. After my father died smoking crack cocaine, my Uncle Isaac went in front of a judge one more time. "I want drug treatment." The judge said, "Why should I give you treatment? You've been committing crimes since you were juvenile." My uncle Isaac said, "Your Honor, everything on my rap sheet could be explained by untreated addiction." They put him in treatment. They called his 13 siblings to come to family night. "We're not coming. We don't like him. He stole from all of us." The counselor called again and said, "We have food." They said, "We'll be there." And his 13 siblings participated in family night. His 26 nieces and nephews participated in family night. 39 of us, the whole tribe, and I use that language intentionally, the whole tribe participated in his family night, and he got sober, and we count 30 people who've gotten sober since. So if you're working with African Americans, you want to really work hard to rally the extended family as a part of recovery. Spirituality is a protective factor. Someone praying for you, and then a sense of humor. The shortest distance between two people is a straight line, is a good laugh. Now, have you ever noticed that groups in our society that have years of oppression, they tend to raise up a lot of stand-up comics. And what funny people do is they take the edge off of oppression. You know, Jews have been experiencing oppression for a long time. Look at all the stand-up comics. This is true for African Americans as well. The oppressed tend to raise up lots of stand-up comics. Some of you might remember Moms Mabley. You certainly remember Red Fox. All these funny people coming out of oppression, like Eddie Murphy and Dave Chappelle. Have you seen Dave Chappelle's special that he has on YouTube called 846, which was the amount of time that the officer sat on George Floyd's neck? You know, funny people, as Steve Harvey says, they have like a third eye in the back of their head. They can see funny and stuff. Check out that comedy on YouTube by Dave Chappelle called 846. Yeah, funny people take the edge out of oppression. Some of you might know Dick Gregory. If he were alive, I think he lived to be almost 100 years old. It's between him and George Byrne as to the oldest stand-up comic, comic in U.S. history. Believe it or not, Dick Gregory was the first African-American that was allowed to look white audiences in the face when he told his jokes. Most of them early on had to look down, or else they wouldn't get hired. You know who hired him? Was Hugh Hefner. He was the stand-up comic for Playboy Club, and he was able to look the audience in the eye. Now, Dick Gregory's claim to fame also is that he was a civil rights leader who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s. And just to show you the situations in which people can have a sense of humor, you might remember this. In the 1960s, Dick Gregory walked into a segregated restaurant in Mississippi and said, "Give me a hamburger." Person behind the counter said, "We don't serve coloreds." And Dick Gregory said, "I don't eat them. Give me a chicken." And when the chicken showed up, the Ku Klux Klan walked in, said, "Whatever you do to that chicken, we're going to do to you." Dick Gregory picked it up and he kissed it. Where would we be as a people without humor? Another protective factor is collectivism, concerned with the survival not just of myself, but with the whole group. Music. Oh, I wish I could play some music for you right now. A sense of we-ness connected to the community. Resilience produced by survival of oppression. You've heard the expression that everything does not kill me makes me stronger. Empathy that comes with like a result of surviving oppression. So note that in the 1960s, the civil rights movement became, Dr. King was leading it in the direction towards the poor people's movement. Because when you've been oppressed, you tend to have empathy for other people who are oppressed. And then another resilience factor is like individuals who can instill hope and prove that success is possible. Does anyone know the reason that African American History Month is in February? If you know the reason, you can put your response in chat. Why is African American History Month in February? Anyone? Why not March? Why not April? Why not June? Why February? What are you seeing, Michelle and James?
Shortest month.
That's what they always say. Let me give you the answer. African American History Month is in February to honor the birthday of two men. One was Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Let me ask you another quick question. Is there anyone who can hear the sound of my voice that go to church on New Year's Eve? And if yes, what is that church service called? You know, while everybody else is getting their drink on, do you ever go to church New Year's Eve? And then what I want to tell you is that there's a lot of African Americans that go to church on New Year's Eve. What are you seeing, James?
Night watch and watch night.
Okay, so check this out. And December 31st, 1862, Africans who were enslaved in the South heard that at midnight that Abraham Lincoln was going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. So they rushed into churches, got on their knees and prayed and looked at the clock and hoping that he would actually sign it when the clock struck midnight. And thus all these years later, there are African Americans who are going to church who will tell you they're going just to be grateful, but they're really going because of what happened January 1st, 1863. The other reason that African American History Month is in February is to support the honored Frederick Douglass, who was said to have been born on Valentine's Day, February 14th. Did you know that Frederick Douglass is the first prominent American recovering alcoholic? You see, if you're Black, if you're African American in recovery, you're like in the same, you're like Frederick Douglass. He was the first prominent American recovering alcoholic. And his famous quote is that we can't stagger to freedom. He said, "What good is it for a people to be free and be enslaved to liquor?" As a matter of fact, Frederick Douglass believed that alcohol was a way to control the slaves. And what he wrote in his autobiography is they would beat us Monday through Friday and then feed us liquor on Saturday. And they figured that once we tasted the liquor, which was medicine for our trauma, then we would want to never escape. So he quit drinking alcohol and he formed what was called the Black Temperance Movement. I've talked about Frederick Douglass in prisons and people are really inspired. You see, what helps African Americans and what contributes to resilience is individuals like Frederick Douglass who can instill hope. Or how about John Lucas? Had a public story of cocaine dependence, got into long-term recovery, became a coach. John Lucas became the coach of the San Antonio Spurs, and he would have huddles where he would stay out of the huddle and just let his players talk. So why do you do that? He said, because I'm a member of Narcotics Anonymous, and there's a thing that's called group conscience. They don't need me to be in the middle of everything. John Lucas was the man that in the 1980s, when NBA basketball players would need to go to drug treatment, when they returned to treatment, he would coach them and provide recovery support at the same time. Or people like Natalie Cole, who died in long-term recovery, the daughter of Nat King Cole. Dr. Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman to go to outer space. I used to work with her father. He was a janitor at an agency that I worked called United Charities of Chicago. He was a janitor, his daughter an astronaut and a medical doctor. How'd she achieve all that? Her father told me that when she was a little girl, he would allow her to watch Star Trek every night as long as she did her homework. And there was a woman on Star Trek named Lieutenant Uhura. And Dr. Mae Jemison, her father told me, wanted to be the next Lieutenant Uhura. What she learned years later is that Lieutenant Uhura almost quit Star Trek. She went to Martin Luther King Jr. from Atlanta, said, I want to quit. Captain Kirk and Dr. Spock have all the speaking lines. And Martin Luther King told Lieutenant Uhura, don't quit Star Trek. There are little girls watching you who want to be you, like Dr. Mae Jemison. Or Michael Jordan, a man that can fly. Or Ben Carson, gifted hands. Or Colin Powell, all these examples of greatness and success. People like Oprah Winfrey, Condoleezza Rice, Michelle Obama. You remember the story about this little boy who was in the White House and he wanted to touch the president's head. And he said, you know, the president, I want to know, is your hair like my hair? Then the president touched his head. Do you know that politicians can eliminate all of his policies, but what they can never get rid of is the impact of that little boy realizing that his hair was like the president's hair. You see, I have a 17-year-old son at home who's never gotten high. And I asked him, what was it like to grow up? And the first president you saw was Barack Obama. And my son said, his presence made me believe I could do anything. My son is 17 years old. He's a freshman at Northwestern University. Let's take a moment to talk about overcoming mistrust. You see, the research suggests that African Americans are less likely to seek therapy voluntarily. So we're more likely to be mandated into therapy. And then we often enter the space not trusting the experience. So my question to you is, what do you think some of the reasons are that African Americans often mistrust counseling? What's the mistrust about, anyone?
Seeing gossip, their pride, bad
I mean, we're
experience.
talking first of gossip. I live in the same neighborhood with these folks getting treatment, and I'm afraid if they knew my business. Keep going, James.
Culture, historical trauma, pride, other people finding out, stigma in our community about seeking therapy. We mistrust because we have not learned to trust our families, because we're taught we had Jesus instead, judged and punished. Cultural belief in keeping things in the home. What happens in the house stays in the house. Tuskegee study, for example. Bad experiences and viewed as weak.
Yeah, someone mentioned bad experiences. Did you know that the research says that 1 out of 10 clients that counselors work with will get worse as a result of the counselor working with them? I'd like to add to your list. So, you know, Black people started off on the wrong foot as it pertains to like psychiatry. In 1851, in the midst of chattel slavery, there was a doctor named Samuel Cartwright that came up with a psychiatric condition, a mental illness called drapetomania. And what drapetomania is, or what he thought it was a mental health condition that made the slave want to run away. Drapetomania, a mental health condition that made the slaves want to run away. So I became curious, what was Dr. Cartwright's treatment for drapetomania? His treatment was, once captured, they would cut off the big toe on both feet. Then he had another psychiatric disorder, the second one on this page, which I can't even pronounce. But that condition, according to Samuel Cartwright, is a mental health condition that makes the slave lazy. And guess what the treatment was of that condition? They would like have the enslaved, take a bath, and then put oil all over their body, and they would beat them. And what I'm suggesting to you was that this was our original orientation to mental health. And then someone mentioned the Tuskegee experiment. Well, between the 1950s to 1970s in Alabama, there were these African Americans who had syphilis, and they went to the clinic in Alabama, Tuskegee, and told that they were given antibiotics for syphilis, but they were really given a water pill. Because what the researchers wanted to discover is how would syphilis spread in the human body if left untreated. And so the message there is that you can't trust institutions because they might experiment on you. How true is that? You know, there's a book that's called The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times up until today. So it's not just something that happened in Alabama in the 50s, but it's still happening today. Have you read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? She died, and the hospital kept her stem cells and used her stem cells to do all kind of research, right? Without her family knowing anything about it. They used this woman's stem cells, this African-American woman's stem cells, to do all kind of research. And her kids found out about it after the fact, years later. So reason African-Americans often mistrust mental health services. Did you know that if African-Americans go to a hospital with a toothache, backache, knee pain, or withdrawing from opiates, that the researchers said that doctors are more likely to withhold needed pain medicine from African-Americans based upon two stereotypes. The first stereotype being that African-Americans can handle more pain, not this one, not physical, and that we're more addictions prone, not true. So we can go to a hospital in pain and not get the medicine that we need. Well, the research also says that African-Americans are more likely to be given chronic diagnosis early. Let me explain. He's 18 years old and he has his first psychotic episode. After all, isn't that the age when they go away to college? The first psychotic episode? He's taken to a clinic, and rather than diagnose him as having an acute psychotic episode, they diagnose him with paranoid schizophrenia and put him on tons of medication for life. Well, African Americans are disproportionately diagnosed with conditions that are often viewed by others as incurable, like antisocial personality disorder. And then here's something that's mind-blowing. In a lot of our large cities, when African Americans seek services, sometimes the first person that greets them is armed security. What's the impact of that? Well, you have tension in your relationship with the police, and then you go to get help, and the first person you see is a security guard. Or they meet you and your service energy is low. And then, you know, counseling is about talking. And historically, African Americans have paid a price for talking. Let us look at history. The price that African Americans pay for speaking their truth, that is talking. So Martin Luther King spoke up. As a result, he was investigated by the FBI, the IRS, and he was assassinated. Malcolm X spoke his truth. He was shadowed by the CIA, the FBI wiretapped his phone, and he was assassinated. Angela Davis spoke her truth. She was labeled as un-American and fired at the university where she worked. And W.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to graduate from Harvard University in 1896, for speaking up, he was labeled as communist and un-American, and he was forced to be exiled in Africa. Well, Paul Robeson, the talented one, he spoke up for civil rights and against racism, and Paul Robeson was exiled to Russia. Well, how about Jack Johnson? By the way, Jack Johnson lived in Chicago, and I'm doing this webinar in my apartment here where I live, condo, and Jack Johnson lived here. And he was the first African-American to win the heavyweight championship of the world in the early 1900s. Did you know the day that Jack Johnson became heavyweight champion of the world, that riots broke out in 25 states in the United States because he put a hold on the idea that whites were superior to blacks in everything. So riots broke out and they indicted Jack Johnson for white slavery. Here's what happened. He lived in Chicago, this building, and he married a woman who was white, and he drove her to another state after they were married. And there was a law in the books called white slavery that said that no white woman in her right mind would drive across state lines with a black male. So therefore, even though she was his wife, he kidnapped her. And they tried to force him to lose a fight intentionally, or else they would put him in prison for a long period of time. He was an outspoken fellow. And I learned that when Joe Louis fought for the heavyweight title 50 years later, It said, we'll let you fight for the championship, but don't date white women and don't be loud and outspoken like Jack Johnson. Muhammad Ali said, I'm not going to the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese never called me the N-word. The price he paid for speaking was he was stripped of the heavyweight title of the world. And then there's Ice-T, who was investigated by the FBI. I think he made a song called Cop Killers. And how did they silence Ice-T? By giving him a job in a program called Law and Order, where they pay him to be a TV cop. And you might recognize Public Enemy, Chuck D, who by all means, his lyrics are revolutionary. But how does he take the sting out of his lyrics? His sidekick, his hype artist, Flavor Flav, is kind of clownish. So the one guy is being clownish, the other one is speaking like a revolutionary, and the one who's being clownish sort of softens the words of the revolutionary. Rappers Ludacris and Nas spoke their truth and lost their endorsements. There's a book that's called The Rage of the Privileged Class. Why are middle-class blacks angry and why should America care? What the author talks about is many middle-class blacks who've gone to college and have advanced degrees, get hired in American corporations, and often they're the last hired and the first fired, but they're expected to, even though they may be passed over by promotion, to go around smiling all the time. But Ellis Close says, don't believe the hype. Many of these individuals in corporate America who are smiling might actually be filled with rage. And then President Barack Obama, he starts speaking his truth. And he was labeled as un-American. He's not one of us. He wasn't even born here. And gun sales dramatically increased. So let's summarize. And there's Afena Shakur, the mother of Tupac Shakur, the Black Panther. She was followed by the FBI and imprisoned. Be quiet is the message. So, what history teaches us, if you speak your truth, if you talk, you can get assassinated, exiled, fired, or labeled as communist on America. So he goes to counseling. Why should I talk? Because I'll pay a price. I've actually seen people of color, African Americans specifically, get kicked out of treatment for speaking and talking about their truth, etc. So my question to you is, given this mistrust and this historical mistrust and these messages that if you talk, it's unsafe, how do you build rapport with the African American clients that you serve? Let us chat. What's your strategy? How do you build rapport? James?
Meet them where they are, create a safe space, share experiences, affirm their beliefs, casual conversation to begin and let them talk, develop a space of synergy, listen and let them take the lead, communicate in a way they understand and empathy.
And thank you so very much, James. And thank you everyone for what you shared. You know, I learned my greatest lesson as to what it takes to really connect with another human being when I was a senior in high school. Actually, the great lesson came 10 years ago. And no, I wasn't a senior in high school 10 years ago. It's been a long time since I walked across the high school stage. When I was a senior in high school, I participated in a sport called cross country. We ran 3-mile races in the woods in November with short film in Chicago. This was a strange sport. And I had a teammate who was Cuban. And my Cuban teammate was the best runner on the team. He invited me to live with he and his family my senior year in high school. So he and I can get up every morning at 5 a.m. to run 5 miles. Sound like fun? I agreed to do it for 2 reasons. One, his mother physically resembles my grandmother, and my grandmother's my heart. And number 2, my Cuban friend's mother, she could really cook like my grandmother. Okay, I'll stay. Now, every night his mother would cook me these elaborate Cuban meals. And without saying a word to me, she would always sit the food directly in front of me. And she would always sit directly across from me, elbows rest on the table while she watched me eat with a smile. I knew the smile meant I expected to eat every drop of the food on the plate. I'd go to bed, wake up in the morning, run 5 miles, but she always greeted me to the kitchen table and where she fixed me a warm breakfast. She would always sit the breakfast in front of me. She would always sit directly across from me, elbows on the table, smiling, watching me eat. I knew that smile meant eat every drop. I've been in contact with my friend for 40 years. And he said to me, for 40 years, my mother asked more about you than all my other friends. What about your friends from Cuba? She asked more about you than all of my friends from Cuba. She's always on my mind as well. Every Mother's Day, my first stop is to her house, where I bring her the largest bouquet of flowers. About 10 years ago, my friend's brother, who was 35 years old, had a brain tumor. And before I could make it to the hospital to visit, his brother died. And 5 days later, they held a funeral, and I brought my wife with me to the funeral chapel for support. As soon as I walked in the chapel, the mother who was sitting in the front row spotted me standing in the back. She said, he's family, sit in the front row. His family is one of the few words I understand in Spanish, so I sat in the front row. That night as I was driving home, I was crying hysterically. I was so angry with myself because I'd never learned to speak Spanish. And all I was thinking was about learning to speak Spanish. I could have shared with the mother how I felt about the fact that she had just lost her son, that I somehow would have helped her with her grief. The next day was the burial, and the mother was standing next to me crying. And a voice came into my head, and the voice said, say something to her, just say something. So I reached over and gave her a hug, and I whispered in her ear the first words I'd ever said to her in my life. I said to her, I love you. And then she said to me, I love you too. This is the first time we'd ever spoken. So now I'm driving home feeling a little better. My wife looks at me and said, you know, you and your friend's mother have a very peculiar way of communicating with each other. You have the purest, the best form of communication. What you have is a heart-to-heart connection. I thought about it. I went to school. I have all these books. And the purpose of every book I ever read was to put something in my head so I could reach a client's head. But where we really connect with another is in the heart. You see, the human heart is the one thing that's stronger than biases, assumptions, and stereotypes. It's the one thing I don't have a defense against. You know, it can overcome mistrust. So I encourage every clinician that works with clients in general, African Americans specifically, which is what we're talking about, is to lead with a loving heart, a caring heart, which can be stronger than biases, assumptions, and stereotypes. As a matter of fact, you ever notice when you say the wrong thing, the first thing people wonder is, where's your heart? And if they sense that your heart is in a caring place, it's amazing the verbal mistakes that can be forgiven. Question, how long does it take a client to decide, you know, during the first session, whether or not they want to meet with you again for a second session? How long does it take them to decide whether they're going to see you again? What do you see, James?
Seconds, first 10 minutes, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 3 minutes, first 5 minutes, 5 seconds.
So what I heard, and thank you, James, is somewhere between a second and 10 minutes. So I believe that we only have a little bit of time to engage. So let us talk. Within the first 10 minutes, we want to do the best job we can at creating a welcoming environment. And voice tone matters. Tone of voice matters. You know, there's a book called Blink, and it tells a story that patients rarely suit doctors they like. And they shared one experiment where they took these doctors and they allowed people to listen to their doctors interviewing their patient for just 30 seconds. You couldn't hear the words because of HIPAA law, but all you can hear is the sound of the doctor's voice. And what they found is that with 90% accuracy, strangers can predict which doctors have never been sued versus which doctors have been sued 2 or more times. And the research said, the warmer the voice tone, the less likely a doctor is to be sued by their patient. You see, when clients make that phone call for help, the tone of voice of the person who answers your phone can go a long way towards determining whether or not the client comes in for their first session or not. You know what doctors' offices do? One thing that they do is that to help to assure that you're going to make the first session is they send you an email or a text or a call the day before. The greeting matters. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever worked with a receptionist that had a real bad attitude? You work with a, yes or no? Put that in chat. Have you ever worked with a receptionist that had a real bad attitude? What are you seeing, James?
Almost without exception, yes.
Yeah, check this out. They're the lowest paid of the organization with the biggest caseload. Because everybody who calls and everybody who walks through that door is a receptionist caseload. So they can be irritated all the time. Or they could be wearing to work one day a pair of shoes that's 2 sizes too small. They're irritated. Or they could have gotten in an argument with their partner in the car on their way to work. They're irritated. But here's my question. Given the experiences of African Americans in America, and they walk into an addictions treatment facility, and the receptionist has a real bad attitude, What's that African American client saying to himself or herself when they encounter the receptionist attitude?
When are they going to come back here?
I'm never going to come back here. Oh, hey, Frank Morales
Hey,
from
Mark.
Illinois. All right, I'm never going to come back here
Hi,
again.
Mark.
How about others? What are they saying to themselves?
Not this place. They're
Not
going to
this
leave
place.
out.
I want to
Not
leave out.
want it.
Yep.
They'll find a new place. Nope.
Yeah, they're saying to themselves, this is another place that I go to where I don't feel welcome. Just like when I went to the restaurant 2 days ago and they greeted me without any energy and no smiles. Another place where I don't feel welcome. Let me tell you how important this is. There's a doctor from Harvard named Ken Minkoff who does seminars with receptionists, not therapists, receptionists, on how to create a welcoming environment. Because he believes that engagement doesn't begin with you, the therapist. That engagement really begins with the receptionist who greets the client. And then what about the pictures on the wall? Years ago, there was a man named Marv Dyson, who was CEO of WGCI radio station, 107.5 FM. At that time, the #1 African-American radio station in the country. And he called our agency and said, I need your agency to provide counseling for our radio personalities. And back then, one of the radio personalities was Hall of Fame DJ Tom Joyner. I'm thinking, I'm going to be Tom Joyner's therapist. And Marv Dyson said, before we hire your agency, we want to have a tour of the agency. And every agency has a wall of fame. And those are the pictures on the wall of people significant to the agency. Marv Dyson got out the elevator and looked at the pictures on our wall of fame. He looked at me and said, no pictures of African Americans on the wall, no pictures of women on the wall, no contract. He was gone like that. And I've been asking myself for 30 years, when clients come into our agencies, we're talking African American clients now, do they see images of themselves on our wall? And if they don't see images of themselves on our wall, then what are they saying to themselves about whether or not I'm welcome here? How about this? When was the last time you looked at the written literature that clients read in your program, or the audio visual videos that we show clients? How seldom do we see people of color in these videos? I remember years ago, we used to show clients when I worked in detox, these $400 videos out of Minnesota. You know, these expensive videos with mostly suburban families with addiction, the picket fence. And we had one video in that program, mostly African-American men in detox living in poverty. That video was called Oscar. It was a 10-minute video on reel to reel. And Oscar was a story, a short story, a clip of a black male shaving. He was in his bathroom shaving on his way to a detox facility. Our clients would sleep through the $400 videos, wake me up when it's over. But whenever we would show Oscar, they would lean forward. And we believe that when they were seeing Oscar, they were seeing themselves. We only have a little while to make an impression. How about an inviting waiting room? You know, I've been a Ryan White evaluator and African-American program. And I asked, what do you like about the program? Everything. What don't you like? The waiting room. Why? Every HIV program that I ever visited, the waiting room is exactly the same. All you see on the walls are posters of herpes, syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia. They say, can't they have a fake Norman Rockwell on the wall or a plastic bonsai? And then there are the magazines. You know, one agency called me and said that 85% of their clients missed their second session, outpatient. The national average is half, but 85% of their clients were missing their second outpatient session. Can you help us? Mark, can you help us? So I sat in the waiting room for 2 days because I wanted to view the agency from the perspective of new clients coming in. And I got bored sitting in the waiting room. I started looking at the magazines. They had Oprah magazine, Good Housekeeping magazine, Martha Stewart magazine. They work with African-American, Latino, Hispanic gang members. Who were the magazines for? We're talking about, and then the length of the wait matters. You know, you keep me waiting in a waiting room too long, I might think it's because you don't like me because of our differences or because of my race. I could be totally wrong. You could be dealing with a suicidal client, but keep me waiting long and my filters kick in. You know, the first thing my field instructor taught me, I forgot everything she taught me except for one thing, that 10 minutes equals 10 minutes. So Mark, notice that counselors often will tell their clients, I'll see you in 10 minutes. And then they don't show up for 20 to 25 minutes. She says, all of our clients have histories of abandonment. When we do that, we've recreated that abandonment. And then when they meet you, the counselor, after they met the receptionist and they were greeted in a warm manner, then your positive service energy goes a long way towards engagement. There's a program on the west side of the city of Chicago called Above and Beyond. And the west side of the city of Chicago is the poorest part of the city of Chicago, mostly African American. Lots of poverty, lots of heroin, lots of crack cocaine, drugs, gangs. And this program, Above and Beyond, on the west side of the city of Chicago, just won an award this year through the Illinois chapter of NADAC, Program of the Year, working with really poor people who are African American. And then get this, through National NADAC, which covers all 50 states, they just won an award as the Program of the Year. They do as good a job as anybody's I've ever seen at like creating a welcoming environment. So what did they do that's so unique? You know, lots of people pay the receptionist the lowest amount paid to anybody in the agency. Their receptionist has a master's degree, and they're rational in psychology. And their rationale is we want people who have empathy answering our phones and the first people to meet clients. And if they're in a crisis, our receptionist has a master's degree. So we're investing money in our receptionist to create a welcoming environment. The second thing they told me to do, there was called the walk-in center model. Let's face it, when you're economically poor and you're hungry, how are you going to remember your next counseling appointment? So what they do is they allow clients to walk in without appointments and they see them right away. And if you're wondering how does that happen and how can that happen, emergency rooms of hospitals operate that way. Banks take people who walk in. Grocery stores take people who walk in. The first thing they do, and this is a large agency, they give their clients a tour around the whole facility, Southern hospitality. They don't walk in front of them or behind them. They walk side by side and they give them a tour. You are welcome here. And then the other way they invest, we invest with whatever we want to invest in when we have money, but they put a lot of money into the decor. So that's one of their waiting rooms for poor clients. Now you see that chandelier? Those are like antelope horns. And clients told me that when I walked in this facility and I saw a lamp made out of antelope horns, I thought that anything was possible if they could do that. However, the director told me those are not real antelope horns. They don't kill animals. As a matter of fact, they feed their clients every day, 3 meals a day, no meat. They told me that they intentionally set the program up to have high ceilings, really high ceilings, so that when clients came in, they wouldn't feel like it was a hospital environment where many African Americans have had horrible experiences. Did you know that in some neighborhoods, the local hospital is known by members of the African American community as a place where you go to die? Not all of these hospitals. They wanted to make sure that their program did not resemble a hospital when patients came in to seek services. Their furnishing said, you are somebody. I remember once working in a program with really economically poor people. A client died in the bathroom. And people did an autopsy and said, how could that client have been dead in that bathroom for so long? And the staff didn't know. Because in this program, the bathroom was so filthy that the staff never stepped foot in that space. They've set this up to say, you know what, you may be economically poor, but we see you as somebody. So let's talk about counseling African Americans with substance use disorders. But before we get into that, we don't have much time. I want to make sure this makes sense to you. I can't see you. If I could look at your facial expression, your body language. So what I want to ask you is, from your perspective, what's the most important thing we've talked about thus far? I want to find out, is this making sense? What's the most important thing so far?
First one up says lead with your heart. The historical reasons why Blacks don't trust. Empathy.
Share common
Remember
experience.
humility.
What'd you say, James?
Remember humility. Frederick Douglass. And let me get back to that comment. It jumped ahead on me. A bunch came in at once. That's good. Remember humility. Importance of environment and approach. Office decor matters. Frederick Douglass, the decorum of that agency, and empathy. And establishing a rapport, engagement, family as a support, protective factors, establishing a therapeutic alliance, and always lead with your heart.
All right, so here we go. I always begin a lot of my therapy with small talk. I learned a therapy that was called structural family therapy, and we always began with small talk. They call that joining. Um, but when I've been a therapist on and off, and back then we were expected to join for 1 minute. But then as I became an older therapist, I asked myself, and this is a real challenge. I challenge you to give yourself this challenge. First off, I don't feel like I have a right to ask clients anything personal about their life unless I know that we're in rapport first. Then I have the right to ask you something personal about your life. And what gets us in rapport is small talk. You know, Maya Angelou told Oprah Winfrey that only equals engage in small talk. It's the great equalizer. So if I know that my client likes the Atlanta Falcons, before each session, I might say, how are those Falcons doing? Small talk. So we join around work, school, interests, travel, hobbies. I had a group of clientele that were teenage African-American males that were mandated by probation. And their mindset was that they'd rather eat sticks and bricks than meet with me. But I noticed that every one of these men that came in, they demonstrated some uniqueness by something they were wearing, and I would sort of comment on their uniqueness. So for example, we had a young man come in that was wearing Chuck Taylor, Converse All-Stars, low-top white. You remember those 1950 gym shoes? And most young men his age are wearing Nikes or the latest Jay-Z's. I joined with him by saying, you know, you are very original. That most of your peers are wearing the latest Nikes or the latest Jordan. You're wearing a pair of Chuck Taylor Converse All-Stars, low-top, black. You must be an athlete. I'm a basketball player. And we joined around our mutual interest in basketball before we ever talked about his drug use. Hats. Young man came in to meet with me. He was wearing a Yankee hat, a New York Yankee baseball hat. He lived 2 blocks away from Wrigley Field where the year the Cubs won the World Series. I said, man, you are so courageous. How do you have the guts to wear that hat around Wrigley Field? Jerseys. Most young men who I meet with for therapy, many of them will come in wearing jerseys. The most common was a retro 23 Michael Jordan jersey or a 34 Walter Payton jersey. This one young man came in meeting with me at number 57. I said, man, I can't talk about why you're here before I talk about the fact that you're wearing number 57 as a jersey. I said, in all the years I've been a counselor, you're the first person who ever came before me wearing number 57 on the jersey. That is so original. And he said, I got it on sale at Kmart. And I said, now I'm really impressed. Because most of the young men I meet with your age would never get a shirt on sale from Kmart. Because you live in a neighborhood where people want to wear the designer jersey. And I said, oh yeah, I noticed. There's no name on the back of your jersey. Are you the kind of young man that doesn't need another man's name on his back to feel okay about who he is? Once I affirmed his uniqueness, we were connected. I was working with a young man that was speaking to me in one-word paragraphs. You have clients that talk in one-word paragraphs. Everything was yes, no, yes, no. I spotted his tattoo. He had one right here that said, trust no one. And then a long one that says Tasmanian devil. I said, so can you tell me about this tattoo that says trust no one? And this is what he told me. He said, there was a girl that I was madly in love. He said, no, there's a girl that I'm still in love with. And she got pregnant by my best friend. Trust no one. And I said, man, you know, it was an old dude talking to a younger man. Can I share something with you? I said, so many of us as men have had our heart broken by a woman, by a girl. I told him, I'm still hurting on one that broke my heart when I was in college, forever ago. I said, but you have a double hurt. Not only did you feel hurt by your girlfriend who got pregnant with your best friend, you also were betrayed by your best friend. And he must have felt really understood because he asked me, he said, can I tell you the first time I ever sought therapy? I said, yeah. He says, I was 9 years old. I went to therapy. My mother asked me to leave the room. She asked me to leave the room. And she colluded with the psychiatrist to give me a psychiatric diagnosis so she could get a bigger check. Trust no one. And then what about the long tattoo, Tasmanian devil? He said, my father left me when I was 4. I'm so mad at him. Sometimes I feel like I'm angry like the devil. Most of these young men, they would play music. I would have them do a concert for me. and I'd inquire who their favorite artists were. We would talk about their future and work. You know, I work with lots of African American males who were lifeguards. Yeah. And you're thinking, well, the most common thing they were dealing with was drowning. That's why they needed to see a counselor. But no, that wasn't it. You know, one of the most common reasons why lifeguards seek therapy across cultures, smoking weed. They have the lungs for it. So one young man was forced to see me because he had weed in the system. And said, why a lifeguard? He said, because the earth is 2/3 water. I said, tell me more. He said, do you know how many children of color, Black and Latino, drown because they can't swim? I said, man, you're beyond a lifeguard. You're a lifesaver. Once I was affirmed him, we were able to make that human connection. The other thing that we want to do is make sure that we have an effective opening statement so that the client knows that we're not trying to force her to do anything that she doesn't want to do. We're not going to try to force him to do anything he doesn't want to do. So here's my statement. Because the client comes in expecting an opponent, another person to tell them what to do. I know I can't make you stop getting high. I will honor whatever decision you make concerning your use. What I'm basically saying to him is that you can relax. You don't have an opponent here. The other thing that's really important to do early on is to focus on strengths. You see, something is wrong with how we're taught to do therapy. We're taught to focus on deficits. Isn't that true? When people walk in, the first thing we do is give them a diagnosis, a deficit, like what's wrong with you. As a matter of fact, for many of us as therapists, the first question we ask clients is, what's wrong with you? I was taught a fancy way to do that.
What is it? You want me to sign
Somebody
up?
have to unmute themselves.
Yes, we got.
I was taught to like ask clients the question, what brought you here? Well, what that question really is how did you screw up your life, right? We ask clients questions like, what's your income? What if that client lives below the poverty line and they have shame? What's your cell phone number? He puts his head down. He says, my cell phone was cut off like 2 months ago. What's your income? Do you work? How many times have you relapsed? Have you ever tried to kill yourself? So those kind of questions leave clients feeling like failures. But what if we ask early on in the helping relationship, strength-based questions like, what do you do well? And how have you been able to endure so much? To the latter question, I think about my grandmother. My father died smoking crack cocaine May 29, 1986. His father, my father's father, died of a heart attack. We think he died of a broken heart. His only child, my father, died. A month later, after her husband died and her son died, my grandmother had a stroke and she never walked again, which meant she could never feed the neighborhood. My grandmother fed the whole neighborhood. A decade later, my grandmother died. And the plan was that me and my siblings would plan her funeral. And how are we going to do that? Because when my grandmother was alive, she did all the planning. My brother wandered through the house and found her Bible and said, turn to the section called the 23rd Psalm and you know exactly what to do. The 23rd Psalm was the part of the Bible that my grandmother recited when she felt stressed. We turned to the 23rd Psalm and a bunch of papers fell off on the floor. And one note said, they were hard to read because she wrote them upside down laying on her back. At my funeral, I want to wear my hair the way I wore it in the 1940s, and we did the best we can. Another note written by my grandmother said, I want to wear at my funeral a white dress and a red rose on the left side. Another note said, at my funeral, I want Sister Sarah to sing Amazing Grace. That song has never been sung more beautiful. One note said, I would like for Reverend Emmett to preach my eulogy. Fine job. Another note said, written by my grandmother, would you ask Deacon Jones to say a few words at my funeral? I know he's shy, ask him anyway. And the deacon got up there with his head down. He did okay. One note said, I want all 5 of my grandkids to speak at my funeral. We all spoke. So following the funeral was the burial. And we're in a limousine and it hit me that even though my grandmother looked so frail and helpless the last decade of her life and she couldn't walk, she was powerful beyond measure. She was so powerful, she was able to plan her own funeral. I've never looked at people the same since. Goethe said, nobody rises to low expectation. He went on to say so poetically, see a person for who they are, they only become worse. See a person for who they are, they only become worse. But see them for who they could be, they become who they should be. How have you been able to endure so much? That's a question around African Americans and trauma. What's the best thing you ever made happen? What is the best 3 moments you can recall in your life? Let's go back up to the third bullet point. What do you like to do in your leisure time? We asked an African-American man that question that was mandated by a judge. Have you ever worked with a 70-year-old court-mandated client who had been using heroin for 50 years? He was grumpy. What do you like to do in your leisure time? I like to talk about my leisure time. All right, I'll tell you. He says, have you ever heard of Miles Davis? I said, yes. He says, I play the drums in my leisure time. When Miles Davis would come to town, I would be his drummer. Would you like to see an album cover where I was listed as Miles Davis's drummer? I'll bring you the album cover next week. So we were guaranteed at least 2 sessions. But my point to you is through that strength-based question early on in our relationship, he was transformed from a 50-year heroin user only to a jazz great. What is your previous life suffering preparing you to do with the rest of your life? That basically says to clients that whatever you've gone through wasn't for naught. What have you learned from what you've gone through? If it's a learning experience, it wasn't the bad thing. As you face those challenges in your life, what sources of strength did you draw from? And which of your experiences has taught you the most about your own resilience? To see when many clients come in, they feel like they've really failed therapy. But when you focus on strengths, it can bring the two of you closer together. So I want to suggest to you, and I can only talk a few more minutes and I'm going to respond to your questions. If we want to eliminate resistance, then we have to honor multiple pathways of recovery. However the client wants to approach their recovery, that's what we do. We don't take away their autonomy. And there have been many pathways of recovery for African Americans, including religious pathways, treatment-assisted recovery, 12-step recovery. It is mythology that African Americans don't do well in 12-step groups. That is mythology. Another pathway of recovery is called shifting allegiance, which is common amongst African American women. Here's how that works. The research says if you ask African American women in the first 4 years of their recovery, how are they maintaining recovery? They'll tell you within the 12-step communities. But if you follow up in the 5th year, many will shift from 12-step to the church. We call that shifting allegiance as a pathway of recovery. Some clients mature out. You know, they get sick and tired of being sick and tired. They just stop using. Medication-assisted recovery. We need to reduce the stigma of medication in African American community. Then the use of recovery coaches. How about this? Individuals in long-term recovery who are from that same neighborhood that will support your recovery in the neighborhood. We call that recovery without walls. And then there's the love of reading. Malcolm X, a member of the Nation of Islam, fell in love with reading. It transformed him in prison, and he led hundreds of thousands of men and women into recovery by teaching them reading, changing what they wore in terms of their clothes, going from eating food that kills you to a healthier diet. And they've led lots of people into recovery. You all know Samuel L. Jackson. I think I'll maybe start responding to your question after I tell you the story. Did you know that Samuel L. Jackson was addicted to crack cocaine? And he was in crack cocaine treatment. And he received a call while he was in treatment from a movie director named Spike Lee, who said, I have a role for you. So Samuel L. Jackson left crack cocaine treatment to play the role of a crack user in a movie called Jungle Fever. He had already did the research. His girlfriend in the movie was Halle Berry, who also was addicted to crack cocaine. And in the movie, his mother was Ozzy Ruby D, who would give him money for crack cocaine and stop doing this crazy dance he would do for her. And during the rehearsals, the man who played his father, Ozzy Davis, saw Samuel L. Jackson do this crazy dance for his mother. He pulled out a revolver and he shot and killed him. And Samuel L. Jackson said, when he heard the sound of the gunshot, it killed the active crack user in him. And he hasn't used crack cocaine in several decades. If recovery is salvation, there are many pathways to recovery. And one way we can reduce resistance is by honoring and recognizing the multiple ways in which people are resolving this. So who has a question as we wind down? All right,
I do have a question if you want, or I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead, go for the question.
I want to know if you believe substance abuse disorder has increased during the pandemic. How are mental health providers handling the surge?
The answer is that it definitely has, and it's because people are experiencing isolation, and isolation is not the best friend of addiction. So where you have isolation, you have an increase in substance use. Where you have loneliness, you have an increase in substance use. Where you have fear, you have an increase in substance use. Where you have unemployment, You have an increase in substance use. So James, I'm going to ask the group a question, and then I'm going to share some closing comments for the group. What I've learned over the years is less about anything I teach, and it's more about the action you take. So my question to you is, what's the action you're going to take when you leave this webinar as a result of the time that we spent together today? What will you do with this information? You can put your response in chat. What will you do with this information that we talked
Continue
about?
training to get my CADC.
Okay.
A couple are asked, research further on many points you brought up, apply what I learned, write things, share with my white allies group at my agency. I'm going to use the information to enhance understanding of all the counselors that work under my supervision. Be more mindful of engagement. Definitely utilize it during sessions.
All right, so here's what I want to share with you. All right, so there was a Puerto Rican boxer from Humboldt Park, the northwest side of the city of Chicago. He had never lost a fight. They had him being the next great one. He had never lost a fight. The short video on ESPN took a turn for the worse, but then it got better. This great fighter was killed by an intoxicated motorist. There was good news. He was an organ donor. So the short film was about his mother meeting the people that received his organs. A man walked in the room that got one of his kidneys. The mother politely smiled and shook his hand. A woman walked in the room that received her son's other kidney. The mother politely smiled and shook her hand. A man walked in that room that received their son's lungs. The mother politely smiled and shook her hand. And then the woman walked into the room that received her son's heart. And when the mother saw this woman that got her son's heart, she lost it with tears in her eyes. She ran over to this woman and said, "Can I give you a hug? Could I put my head against your chest one more? Can I put my heart against your head against your chest?" Because she wanted to hear her son's heartbeat one more time. If we want to engage and connect, it's not about our head, it's about our heart. And when we approach this work with a loving heart, it's amazing who we can connect with. Whether you're from the same culture or different cultures, the heart is really important. And if we treat every client we work with like an opportunity to learn, then we'll go a long way in this work. You know, it's only a small percent of the communication between people that are the words that come out of our mouth. It's body language and facial expression. And especially in cross-cultural situations, if we pay attention to how our words are impacting clients, then those can be learning experiences as well. So keep learning. Last story, and then I'll show you something that I want you to see before we're done. My friend Juan was Puerto Rican, living in Humboldt Park as well. This little boy told his father, "Poppy, I'm going to be the next Roberto Clemente. My hero, Roberto Clemente, a right fielder for the Pittsburgh Pirates Hall of Famer, humanitarian." You see, Roberto Clemente fixed houses for people in Puerto Rico during the off-season. He built houses for people in Puerto Rico. I'd like to think that if Roberto Clemente were alive following the hurricanes, he would be building houses for people in Puerto Rico. Anyway, my friend Juan became homeless, sleeping outside on the very baseball diamonds where he had dreams of becoming the next Roberto Clemente. Heroin addicted and homeless, eating in soup kitchens, got into recovery. And Juan told me to tell you to stop telling clients that things will get better right away, because things don't always get better right away in recovery, but they will. So Juan told me that as soon as he initiated recovery, the state of Illinois called up to him and they started garnishing his paycheck for money he owed the state in the past. He said, "Mark, they were taking so much money out of my paycheck that I felt like I was homeless again because I was eating in soup kitchens." He was about to relapse. And he ran into a man that he went to treatment with earlier. And the guy said, "Don't relapse. Set up a meeting with the state and tell him your story. Don't get high." He set up a meeting with the state and said, "Listen, I'm in recovery, but I feel like I'm homeless again because I'm eating in soup kitchens because of the money coming out of my check." And the employee from the state said, "Wait a minute, you were homeless?" I said, "Yeah. When we served those garnishment papers, whose house was that? My mother's. You didn't live there?" "No. Illegal serve. Case dismissed." He tore up the paperwork in front of Juan. Juan places more people in sober housing than anyone else in the state of Illinois out of gratitude. And he went to his father's gravesite and he said, "Poppy, I've become Roberto Clemente. I house people." when you help people with their recovery, they're going to start helping people, and the people they help are going to help people. And it basically means your great work never ends. If you want to reach me, you can, for the next 101 years, we can be in contact. If you want to know why do I still have an AOL address, because I have abandonment issues, I have work to do. Here's how you reach me, and we can stay in contact. I'm the curator of the Online Museum of African American Addictions Treatment and Recovery. There's the link. If you go to that website, I have so much information for you on how to work effectively with African Americans in addiction. I bet I have 300 hours worth of work on there, DVDs, videos, music, etc. So, on behalf of the Southeast ATTC, thank you so very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.